You're back, and I'm glad for it. Sunday Morning Cafe, where the conversation has been revolving around resilience. And through the course of the summer, we've had a series on resilient relationships. I'd like to return to the topic of an important prerequisite for resilient relationships or intimate relationships, and that prerequisite is right relationship with the self, intimacy with the self. I'm going to reach all the way back to the 16th century, to that towering mystic and psychologist in her own right, Teresa of Avila. Her image for the self was of a house with many, many rooms in it, maybe even a mansion with many rooms in it. Her sense of spirituality was to go to those ever more interior rooms of the house, to go past those rooms that are set up just for company to see, to those more intimate rooms in the house. So I want to steal that image and use it in my own way. I want you to imagine that you found your way to that staircase that goes down and down and down into yourself. And imagine that after an arduous journey down and down, you've made it to what you think is the bottom floor, but you notice a Rathskeller door there. So you're going to go down even deeper by opening that door up, taking the ladder down, and to your surprise, there is this boardroom with chairs around this table and a CEO's chair. And around that table that is the deep part of the self are all the parts of the self gathered around. Now, lest you think I'm saying we all have multiple personality disorder, this image of parts of the self is as old as Gestalt psychology from the 1950s onward. What Gestalt psychologists noticed is this kind of phenomenon. You know, part of me would like to quit smoking, but another part doesn't want to. And what Gestalt means in German is the whole. So the whole point of this brand of psychology is, how do I get these parts of the self to talk to each other, to integrate them? Now, talk to any of my colleagues or to me, and when you get talking about parts of the self, there are these kind of archetypes or those characteristic parts of the self that show up in just about anybody's counseling office. One of those parts of the self is the inner child. That's the part that's vulnerable, that feels insecure at times, feels scared, feels sad, but is also really spontaneous. The other characteristic of this inner child is that's the part that at times wants what it wants when it wants it. Another part, the inner critic. That's the amalgam of all of those people who've had some kind of authority. And generally, the inner critic's got a dimension of those folks who didn't really know how to exercise authority in a kind way. That kind of inner cop that can live inside of us. Now, the good thing about the inner cop or critic is it knows how to kind of think about boundaries and at times is invested in motivating of the self. It's just that its methods a lot of times aren't great. A third part of the self that you frequently notice when you're a therapist is that part of the self that's like the inner teenager. Do you feel like I'm talking about Russian dolls? All the parts that we have been are still in there. The inner teenager is the part that, on the good side of it, notices injustice and speaks up about that. The more shadow side of the inner teenager is whenever it feels like someone is exercising undue authority, whether or not they are, that's the part that wants to kind of flip off that person. So check out this phrase. I'm a grown-ass man. I don't need you to tell me that. I'm a grown-ass. That frequently, so the trick here is not to excise any of these parts and throw them out of the boardroom. It's to make sure they don't find their way into the CEO's chair. Who you want in the CEO's chair is the most mature part of you, the part that is capable of stepping back, reflecting, and integrating these parts into. So you listen. It's like the child in the back. You don't want to hand them the car keys when they're 3 years old, but you do want to listen to them say what they want, and you're the arbiter of how we get to that goal or not. So one of the reasons why this image of the inner child took off about the 1980s till now is, one, it's an image that's accessible to all of us. Now, obviously, you're not going to open up a person and find the right microscope to get, oh, there's the inner, it's not like that. But it's a really powerful metaphor that helps you get in touch with an important constellation of emotions and experience, because we've all had experience with small children. either nieces, nephews, grandchildren, our own children. And a child who's small enough, like that inner child who's like 3 or 4, needs an adult to take custody of them and direct them and redirect them. So I want you to imagine for a second in my own parenting, when I was taking my little ones out, I wanted them to be experienced by my friends and relatives as somewhat cute, charming, worth hanging out with. And so I made it a point to pack snacks. So if they got hungry, I can feed them something so they didn't get nasty. I made sure they got their naps, because a tired child, you've seen it happen, the kind of tantruming that come. I would bring toys so they would have some play that they could get involved with. And I'd make it a point that when needed, I'd step away from the adult conversation and I'd hang out with them a little bit. So what I want to say is that skill set works nicely. Earlier I said we want to make sure that in the CEO's chair is the most mature part of ourself. Instead of CEO, I could have said, how do we parent that inner child of ours? Well, here's one way. In the recovery community, they talk about this acronym, HALT, which stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. A good parent knows how to do things to prevent hungry, angry, lonely, tired. What else they're good at is when they notice that that inner child is hungry, angry, lonely, tired, what do? You halt. That's what it spells. You halt and figure out how to meet those needs in some way that you can. Do I need to eat something here pretty soon? If that anger is there, to not like shame yourself for feeling angry, but what's the source of that? And see if you can get to what we can do to remediate it. Take time out, like with my kids, I'd take time away from the adult crowd and get with that inner child. Take that alone time to get with that inner child. So some implications that go with this, in addition to halt, another one would be, do you have a habit you're trying to lose or a habit you're trying to gain? I want you to imagine for a second that there's this toddler who's taking their very first step. Can you imagine a parent doing this? You call that walking? You look like Frankenstein. Oh, and did you notice you fell on your butt? What's wrong with that? That's not walking. You would never do that. What a parent does, a good parent, is like, hey, you walked. And there's the clapping, and they're do it again, and come here. And there's all that happens. With this image of the inner child, if you're trying to change a habit or grow a habit, you're going to fall sometimes. But you're going to approximate it. That's what that little toddler does. He approximates walking and you cheer it on. So finding a way to cheer on that inner child when you're even approximating, but I only lost 2 pounds and it's been a month. You cheer that on in yourself. You find a way to, instead of saying, oh, you call that weight loss? You don't do it that way. You parent yourself like a nurturing, loving parent who's also firm. Here's another implication. There are mornings when I wake up and I go, oh, I didn't get enough sleep last night. And if I'm self-parenting properly, instead of saying, Wagner, get your ass out of bed. I mean, you can wake up a child like that. Far better to be like, Tom, if you get up, you can mix up that delicious cup of coffee just the way you like it. And we can read the paper before we get started. You see what I'm doing there? That reward system. You talk to your inner child about that reward system through the course of the day. It's another implication of the inner child and how to parent that inner child. A couple of exercises I'd like to suggest. If you can find an old picture of yourself when you were like 4 years old, 3 years old, study it a little bit. For that matter, study other children that are like 3 years old, 4 years old, and kind of watch. Let yourself delight in them. Let yourself delight in that small person that you used to be. See if your affection for yourself, in other words, that intimacy with self can grow as you begin to experience yourself that way. Another exercise you can try that works for some, not for others, is you get your journal out and you draw a line down the middle of the page. You put your pen in your non-dominant hand when you want to speak out of the place of the inner child. So you could start off with adult in your dominant hand. The parent says, how are you doing today? You move the pen, you let the inner child talk about what they're feeling, what's going on, and see if when that script looks like a child's script, you are in touch with the inner child. See if that might happen for you. Maybe it will work, maybe it won't. Here's another exercise that I learned from a Buddhist chaplain at Barnes Jewish Hospital. He talked about, so the trick isn't to be harsh with that inner child. The trick is, how do you put that inner child on your lap and embrace that inner child? Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when that inner child just wants what he wants when he wants it, to bring affection to the self. Do you see an exercise like that growing self-compassion over time? Growing self-compassion. Now, I have a confession to make. I used Teresa of Avila's image way differently than she would. If she was sitting out there in my audience, she'd say, well, now wait a minute. You did not get to the deepest room just yet. There's one more level down you've got to go if you really want to talk about intimacy with the self. And it may just be that I'll study her a little bit more and have something to say about intimacy with the self that she'd go, yeah, there, you got it right. But until that time, we'll see you next week as you might try reacquainting yourself with that inner child that never really did go away. I'll see you next week.